welcome to Rising. We're back after the long holiday weekend, and it's good to be here. Brianna, how was your Memorial Day?
It was great. I went home to Cleveland. The weather was great. Family was great. It was a good time. How about yourself?
Good. I had family visiting from out of town, and we did the whole Monuments tour for someone who had actually never been to D.C., so it was very Memorial Day appropriate.
That's very charming, Robbie. All right, back to the nitty-gritty.
Yes, back to the news. I believe there was some breaking.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy have substantially finally struck a deal on the budget.
Yeah.
We've got good news. Just spoke with Speaker McCarthy, and we've reached a bipartisan budget agreement that we're ready to move to the full Congress.
The deal is now being sent to Congress as the White House and Senate will try to make a mad dash to pass the bill before the government defaults on June 5th, as Secretary Janet Yellen has said it would in a recent address. Here's more of Biden on the matter.
They said they'd only do it on condition that it have all these cuts in it. I said, I'm not going to do that. You pass the debt ceiling, period. I'll negotiate with you on the cuts, what you say, what's going to happen, what the budget's going to look like. That's what we are negotiating in order to get to them deciding that they're going to go along with a new debt ceiling, meaning that it's not attached. It's something totally different attached than was attached before. But if you want to try to make it look like I made some compromise in the debt ceiling, I didn't. I made a compromise on the budget.
Now, what exactly is the deal? Here to help break it down for us is the Hill's congressional reporter, Michael Schnell. Welcome.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So give us the details. What does this compromise look like right now? We're seeing some cuts to IRS funding. Republican wins are cuts to IRS funding, some work requirements for SNAP benefits, and then, take us through it.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So the top of the meat and potatoes of this debt limit agreement is that it'll raise the borrowing limit for 2 years. So we won't have to deal with the debt ceiling increase until after the 2024 presidential election. This was a top priority of Democrats. They did not want to have to deal with this showdown again before the election. So that is the top line main detail of the bill. And then there are a number of spending cuts and, as you mentioned, work requirements, which were priorities of Republicans. I'm just going to read off my notes page here since I want to be sure that I get all the particulars properly. It caps defense spending at $886 billion for fiscal year 2024. That is in line with President Biden's budget request from earlier in the year. And then it caps at its $895 billion for fiscal year 2025. When we talk about those work requirements, it adds some beefed up work requirements, which again was a priority of Republicans. And then another part is you talk about that IRS funding. The bill rescinds $1.4 billion in funding that was appropriated for the IRS as part of the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed last year. And then it also rescinds billions of dollars in unused COVID-19 funding. This was basically money that was appropriated during the pandemic. But now that Congress has passed legislation saying that ending the COVID-19 national emergency, this bill claws back billions of those dollars in unspent funds. So those are just a couple top line figures and main parts of this bill. But look, it was a compromise between President Biden and between Speaker McCarthy. Both liberals and conservatives are not thrilled with it. Nobody got exactly what they wanted, but this is the compromise in the middle deal that Kevin McCarthy and President Biden came to over the weekend.
I mean, what do you say to people who feel like this is a compromise that was completely at the expense of working Americans and that only politicians could celebrate? You're looking at student debtors as part of this so-called compromise, not only having student debt relief kind of off the table, it's been that way since it got caught up in the courts, but it mandates that student debt relief is going to end, the moratorium is going to end in August. Moreover, the work requirements that were discussed are basically, the argument is that it's going to save the government some money by kicking some needy families, poor people, et cetera, off of receiving certain TANF and other kinds of government benefits. And yet there was absolutely no appetite for raising taxes on the rich, repealing the Trump tax cuts, which added $1.7 trillion to the deficit, or cutting military spending by even $1, as you mentioned. The military spending, being capped at the level that Biden anticipated asking for next year anyway. So, what do you make of the winners and losers of this compromise?
Yeah, well, look, President Biden and Speaker McCarthy have been very open in saying that this was not everything that they wanted, right? This is not their ideal piece of legislation. Republicans are frustrated that the legislation did not go far enough, that it didn't go as far as they wanted. It was, it was not as aggressive as the Limit, Save, Grow Act that House Republicans passed last month. But on the other side of the coin, Democrats were frustrated by a number of provisions that were included in this bill. Remember, at the beginning of this saga, Democrats were pushing for a clean debt ceiling increase. But what the two principals, Biden and McCarthy, have been saying over and over again is that this is what happens when you have a compromise. Look, let's just look at the reality of Washington right now. You have a House controlled by Republicans, you have a Senate controlled by Democrats, and you have a White House occupied by a Democrat. That means there's going to need to be some sort of compromise in Washington when you talk about these high stakes negotiations. And that's what McCarthy and Biden came to this weekend. They've been open that they're not thrilled and it's not everything that they would have wanted. It's not their ideal piece of legislation, but they're saying that the alternate of defaulting on U.S. loans and having the country's first ever default would be more catastrophic than passing this piece of legislation. So that's how they're pitching it to their lawmakers. We'll just have to see how the vote shakes out tomorrow.
But Michael, what do you make of that framing? Because some people say that's an inaccurate portrayal of what's actually going on, that there was not a necessity to have this debt ceiling crisis, that it's a manufactured crisis by conservatives who are trying to extract cuts that they weren't able to get in the course of the legislative process, that the debt ceiling has been raised innumerable times under Republican presidencies, that this is trying to negotiate what couldn't be done legislatively and at the expense of working people, and that there is not the kind of fiction that there is not a consensus among Americans in favor of a number of policies that could have really raised money for the U.S. government and also cut spending, principally cutting military spending and taxing the rich. Majority of Americans supported billionaires tax, for example, but those kinds of programs aren't on the table. Is it accurate to say that there is a constrained framing of what's going on here that is obscuring some real consensus that exists in the United States and the unwillingness of both political parties to actually deliver for working Americans?
Well, look, I think that the way that Speaker McCarthy and President Biden are seeing this is that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that the U.S. could default if the debt limit is not raised by June 5th. That's on Monday. And I know congressional leaders up here, particularly Republican leadership, they have, because there have been some conservatives who have questioned what would happen if we went over that X date, what would happen if the borrowing limit was not increased. But we've seen Republican leaders, specifically those Republican negotiators who worked on this deal, say on a number of occasions that they trust Janet Yellen, that Janet Yellen has the experience and that she has the intelligence to know when this X date is going to come and what's going to happen with the borrowing limit. So that's been the state of play and the perspective that lawmakers are coming at this from. So whether or not they think that the deal is strong enough for their constituents or enough for the American people, they have recognized that there is a deadline here and that experts and analysts, administration officials had been warning on a number of occasions what would happen if the U.S. barreled over that X date. So that's the way that they've been coming at it and saying, okay, this is the deal that we have. There are some sweeteners in there for both sides of the aisle. There are some provisions in there that can get Democrats and Republicans on board. Now it's just a math game. Now they need to sell it to their lawmakers and sell it to their constituents to get enough support to pass it through both chambers, get it signed by President Biden, and avoid that default on Monday. Because again, that is what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned of, and that is the mindset that lawmakers are coming to this from.
Right. From the Republican side, I doubt this is going to appease this deal. Conservative constituents who wanted more serious cuts to government spending, winning on IRS funding is, I guess that's probably the most significant ideological victory for conservatives. The work requirements is something, lawmakers wanted, but we're not going to balance the budget on that. I'm seeing a lot of Republicans who say they're going to vote against it, including Representative Nancy Mace, for instance, just railing against this deal on Twitter, saying, this is basically going to, this only slightly claws back pandemic era growth of government. So it's you described it as a sweetener. I see how only maybe people in Washington happy with it, but no one else.
And Michael, isn't it the case that Republicans can only lose two votes here, and that there is this McCarthy block of holdouts that we saw make a big fuss, a lot of trouble for Republicans back in January. What are the votes looking like here, and how many can Republicans lose?
Yeah, so this is a different type of vote that we're going to see shake out as opposed to previous votes in this Congress. And that's because lawmakers are going to be voting on a compromise that was struck between Biden and McCarthy. So there's an expectation that a number of Democrats are going to come on board and support this piece of legislation. In fact, we've already seen some come on board and say that they will vote for this, saying that, listen, they're not thrilled with the provisions in there. If they could write the legislation themselves, this is not what they would have come out with. But nonetheless, this was the best deal that President Biden could negotiate given the situation. And with the deadline creeping up on them, they're planning to vote on it. But you guys are absolutely correct. There are a number of conservative lawmakers and a number of liberals even who are frustrated by this deal. Conservatives are not happy with that, are not happy with how far it goes. They don't think it's aggressive enough. And liberals are frustrated with how much is actually in this piece of legislation. So look, going into this Democratic and Republican leadership, we're basically aware that the most conservative in the Republican Party and the most progressive in the Democratic Party were unlikely to vote for this legislation. But the bipartisan nature of it gives them the ability to lose those people on the wings of the party, so to say, and rely on a hodgepodge of moderate lawmakers who will, in the end of the day, likely come out and support this legislation. Just yesterday, Democrats had a big boost in this venture when the leadership for the New Democrats Coalition, which is a center-left organization up on Capitol Hill that has almost 100 lawmakers in it, the leadership of that group endorsed the legislation, calling on Congress to pass it as quickly as possible. That's a type of lawmaker that leadership is going to have to be relying on, ones that are in the middle, more moderate lawmakers. So when you talk about Republicans, typically they're not able to lose more than 4 or 5 members on any given vote, on a partisan vote. But this is expected to be a bipartisan vote since it's on an agreement that was made between Biden and McCarthy. So even if you lose those conservatives and a couple liberals on the left, likely a moderate crop of lawmakers will be able to carry this over the finish line.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.